Welcome to the Sports Governance Podcast, the place where we dig into the systems, decisions, and power structures that shape sports all around the world. My name is Yunus Fireri, and for this sixth episode, we turn our attention to the Olympic movement just days before the opening of the Winter Games in Milano Cortina. As the spotlight moves toward the competition, celebrations, and spectacle, this episode asks a different set of questions. Who do the Olympic Games really serve today? How athlete-centered is the Olympic system in practice? And what does access, inclusion, and accountability actually look like in winter sports, which remain among the most expensive and unequal in the world? To explore these questions, I'm joined by Sang-Eun Lee. Sang-Eun is a former winter athlete, an IOC Young Leader, and the founder of the Dream League, Korea's first women's ice hockey league, developed within the IOC Young Leaders program. Her work sits at the intersection of athletes' experience, institutional reform, and grassroots participation. In this conversation, we reflect on athletes' voice and power, gender equity in winter sports, and what the upcoming games can and cannot realistically change once the Olympic flame goes out. Let's break it down. Sang-Eun, thank you so much for joining me for today's episode. You've been involved in sport from multiple angles, as a former winter athlete, as an IOC Young Leader, and through initiatives like founding Korea's first women's ice hockey league. Before we get into the broader questions around the Olympics and governance, could you tell us a bit about your journey in sports and how the Dream League emerged within the IOC Young Leaders program?
Yes, so as you mentioned, thanks for the great introduction. I was a former athlete in 3 different sports: short track skating, speed skating, and ice hockey. When I was doing short track skating and speed skating, it was a solo sport, so I really didn't get to experience much about teamwork. And as a super introverted person, I always had this urge to take part in team sports. So that's how I got to ice hockey, because I skated well. It was quite easy, fairly easy to get into that sport. And as you can imagine, it was super difficult throughout the whole experience in Korea, because I was probably the only girl in every single team that I participated, and there was no women's game at all at the time. So I always kind of grew this mindset that whenever I gain the expertise and skills and resources for that, I would love to grow women's games and create environment for women to play hockey safely. And then also I had this dilemma when I was in high school, that back in the days, if you play ice hockey, you naturally become the candidate for a national team. But the thing is, you had to choose your career options between pursuing your academics in college or playing ice hockey in the national team. And obviously at the time, I could really clearly see that pursuing academics is a much longer term option and sustainable in a way. So I kind of had to quit hockey at the time, right before going to college. But then, and I didn't really could see myself playing hockey again. But then when I was in college, the Olympics in my country, Pyeongchang 2018, happened, and I got the opportunity to work for the women's games. And that's when I really got to learn how the other European and American countries grew their own sport of women's ice hockey. And that really inspired me and shaped my rough idea into a bit more clear idea of creating women's league in my country. So right after the Olympics, I kind of started researching and gaining more knowledge about women's games. And 2021, finally I became the young leader with the idea of creating the Dream League, the women's hockey league in Korea. So yeah, that's how the Dream League was born. It's been going pretty well. The number of participants has been growing every year, doubling and tripling. And yeah, I'm super honored to be able to do that.
We see that the Olympic movement often talks about being athlete-centered. But from your experience as a former winter athlete and an IOC Young Leader, what does that actually mean in practice, and where does it fall short in your opinion?
So the IOC and I believe many international federations and national federations are trying their best in gaining athletes' voice in the decision-making process. For example, there's Athletes Commission in every single organization, including the IOC. I am a part of the Athletes Entourage Commission, which is the commission that discuss about the entourage members, basically coaches and referees and all the administrative parts, to better support the athletes. So I believe all the initiatives that are happening within the sporting organization is pretty much athlete-centered. I mean, if the athletes don't exist and if they cannot thrive, the games cannot thrive. So that's the basic, narrative around the governance, I'd say, and that's why the organizations are trying their best to really bring athletes together in their decision making process. The Athletes Commission, what they're speaking within their commission meetings and all the forums, summits, they truly care about the voices that were raised there and really bring it up to the final decision-making process. The minutes are there and become the candidates for the future decision-making process. So yeah, all in all, I believe it's pretty much the center of the governance, and that's how the whole governance can exist, I'd say, within the Olympic movement as well.
Okay, so from what I understand now, like unlike other international organizations, the IOC actually gives a voice to the athletes, right?
Yeah, and I believe the other federations do so
I'm
too.
not talking about federations. I'm talking about other organizations in other, like for example, in football, because I'm very much football centered. The athletes not really have a voice. But the thing is, okay, so athletes, they have a voice within the IOC. But who do you think benefits the most of Olympic Games, for instance, the Winter Olympic Games, for instance, this one in Milano, Cortina, the athletes, or like everyone benefits? But in your opinion, who benefits the most, like the organization, the athletes, or the host cities?
Athletes.
Okay.
Athletes. I think it's athletes because everything, like so for example, I'm working for the education part for the athletes, right? And the whole material is that comes from athletes' voices. We do like surveys every other time to acknowledge what they are aware of, what they're not aware of, and we find out the knowledge gaps there, and we try to bring more materials for them to serve them. So like even those small things are coming from the athlete voices, and I believe everything like the games, operations, the village, the entertainment part of it, everything comes from the athletes. Also the fans, of course. The games are especially the Winter Olympic Games. We are trying much more effort, trying to bring more effort to bring more fan base by doing all the torch relays. There are fan zones in every venue. So yeah, basically the athletes and the fans are the center of the games, and they are the ones who benefit the most, in my opinion.
Okay, so we also see that winter sports and Winter Olympics, unlike the ones in summer, are structurally more expensive and geographically limited compared to summer sports. So how does that affect access, gender equity, and who even gets the chance to become an Olympic athlete?
Yes, it clearly sets the bar high in terms of accessibility, especially let's say sports like ice hockey, everything, basically every sport that I practiced, I think it costs way more than any other sport. For example, you bring the example of football, you just need a ball and a pretty good decent footwear. But when it comes to skating, you have to kind of customize your skate when it gets to a certain level, and that costs at least a couple thousands. So yeah, it's definitely a very expensive sport. Ice hockey even more. The whole kit, I cannot really imagine how high it can be. So it really definitely brings double layers when it comes to also gender equality, because on top of the fact that you are a female, you also have to, raise more money than usual to play that sport itself. So, and also when it comes to sponsorships, it also brings much more of a higher barrier, because from the sponsor's perspective, it's just expensive sport. It cannot really fall into the agenda of ESG, because it's a pretty luxurious sport, so it cannot serve the audience by saying, "Oh, we're providing sporting opportunity for those who are not privileged in the society to become a better person," because it's an expensive sport. So, like, from the sponsor's expensive, why would you sponsor those expensive sport when you can just simply give them some balls? So it's definitely a much more complicated process for all parts. For administrative part, the sponsorship, it's tough. From the coaches, obviously a little more, it's harder for them to really convince the parents when it gets to the higher level. If the athlete is really becoming the elite athletes, it costs obviously more, so it's harder for them to convince the parents to invest on their children. So it's hard for the coaches as well. And also when you mentioned gender equality, obviously, yeah, like it's in many countries still, women are economically, financially in a less privileged position, so it also adds layer there. So yeah, it makes every part of the sport more inaccessible. So yeah, I am aware of those parts.
Okay, so the Dream League was developed within the IOC Young Leaders framework, but it still responds to a very concrete challenges in women's ice hockey in the Korean context. So, what gaps did you identify in the existing system that this project is trying to address?
So the key gap I found is that when there is resource, it has to be distributed relatively, right? We are aware of the fact that there are less women's players, but for sure it has to be distributed according to the number of players and from what they need. And sometimes not being the minority doesn't mean that they require less resource, because actually when it comes to minority, they might require more resource to develop, to better support, to create their games and so on. But that was really not happening within our governance in the national federation. And also because of that, the vicious cycle of the minority becomes way more minority happened. So I clearly acknowledge that there must be someone who's really made the start in investing extra more on the minority, so that they can really start the process of overcoming the gap. And obviously there was no women's game, which is a huge problem, because when you are to acquire the position as national federation, you have to have women's games, because women's ice hockey is Olympic sport and you are serving for that sport. So basically what the federation did was they did create the games, but within the national team players. So only the national players will be able to play the games. I have mentioned though that if you play ice hockey back in the days, you do require your position in national team mostly, but it was not definitely everyone. Obviously there were players in the countryside who are not really able to access the infrastructure in the main cities.
I just have a question, like in terms of numbers before you started the project, and like if you compare it
Yes.
to now, like do you have numbers
Yes, so basically the female players in 2021, before I started the Dream League, the female players were around 2,000. And then the men's players were more than 8,000 in the whole country. So it was one fourth, right? And now, after the Dream League has developed, now the women's hockey has grown to more than 4,500. And then the men's side is around 6,000. So it is really, closing the gap.
Yeah.
There are multiple reasons why men's hockey decreased and the women's hockey grew. Obviously, the key part from the women's side is the Dream League, but also, um, I think by creating the Dream League, it really addressed all the problems that were happening within the governance system, I'd say. The corruption part, the safeguarding part, the inaccessibility. There was less inclusivity in terms of the initiatives that the National Federation was bringing on. So, yeah, I am kind of proud of the fact that I was able to address that. And obviously, we have still a long way to go because when it comes to men's hockey, we have elite school athlete system. So basically, there are schools where the athletes can pursue academics and hockey both. But when it comes to women, we still don't have middle school, high school, university. We have no system where student athlete can survive. So they have to choose just one, or they have to go abroad. So those things that are the next steps for us, but still, when it comes to the grassroots level, up until like teenage players, we are doing pretty well in really lowering the barrier. We have also mentioned the cost of gears, right? So, but the Dream League, it's a special case within the whole national system because I brought the sponsor to really cover all costs of playing the game. So we cover the ice hire, we cover the operational personnels. So all that athlete has to have is just bring their gear themselves and their gear. So at least it's really cutting the cost there. So whereas in other competitions in the men's game, they do have to pay a certain amount of fee to play the game. So this is how I am really trying to lower the barrier through the Dream League.
Just going back to the Milano Cortina Olympics that is starting like in a few days, what should we realistically expect in terms of long-term impacts for winter sport participation, especially for women once the games are over?
Yeah, I mean, Milano Cortina is a quite monumental event because we are reaching the highest number of female athletes, 47.8%, right? So it's the highest number of percentage of female athletes. So that's something to remember, and we hope it grows more and more, 50, sometimes even more. So that we can really represent how much winter sport has also gained their inclusivity and gender equality throughout the years. But obviously, the future of winter sport is really sometimes concerning. It is true that with the environmental change, all the snow sports, also in the hot ice sports, it's getting more and more difficult to host big events, and even just practicing for athletes, it's just getting more and more difficult, right? So I am aware, for example, in ice hockey, there's an initiative called Green Hockey. So they created basically artificial ice to really cut down the impacts on environments by generating all that impact carbon footprint by making the ice. So there are people who are working on that side, so that's good news. But still, it is true that there are less cities competing to host the games. So that's a difficult part on the governance side.
Okay, so now we're gonna go back to the IOC. As you were telling me, IOC is doing huge work for athletes, but of course there is always room for improvement. So from your perspective, where is accountability weakest in the Olympic system? What do you think? Athlete welfare, gender equality, post-career supports? We talked about access to decision making, but yeah, where do you think there is the biggest room for improvement?
I definitely think inclusivity and navigating sport through difficult political dynamics is the toughest part at the moment with the what's happening within the world. We have LA coming up, the World Cup coming up, and it's all happening in the midst of all that chaos. This is my personal opinion, by the way. I'm not representing IOC's behalf, but we always say Olympic movement is different. It does not go along with politics. It's never political. That's the virtue that we're pursuing. But obviously, with what's happening in the world, it's no longer a political issue, but human rights issue, right? Like what's happening with ICE and
The human rights issue are a political issue at the end of the day.
yeah. That's the thing. That's the dilemma we're dealing with. We don't want to be political, but when it becomes intrusive to human rights, we have no option but to, go through the political issues. So I think this is always going to be a dilemma, and I have big respect for Courtesy Coventry in really trying her best to at least tune into every stakeholder's positions. She often has mentioned that we're not trying to take one's part. We are always trying to bring everyone into the same position and give them same opportunity, which is going to be nearly impossible. So I think when the magic of Olympic movement and IOC really pushing the nations to really prioritize peace and Olympic values first, at least during the Olympic Games, as we have made the truce within the UN Convention last winter. I think it really opens the door for at least for some time to bring back to where we started, prioritizing the values of peace, friendship, respect, all that. So that's what I'm hoping for the Milan Cortina as well, and I am also hoping for LA as well. Yes, it is tough because it is in the center of where everything is crazy is happening. But also it's true that it's a key opportunity for them to at least contribute towards peace and navigating through that tough narrative. So we never know what's gonna work, what's not gonna work. But I think it can be a double-edged sword, basically.
I am actually pretty positive about Milano Cortina, but personally I don't know about LA. We will see. And the thing is, I have a pretty radical sense about the role of politics in sports, but let's not go into it right now because it's not the topic of the day. But if the Olympic movement genuinely wanted to shift, and it's actually shifting the power toward athletes, what is one structural change, not a slogan, you think would make the biggest difference, like a radical change?
So yes, it should be athlete centered, and it is pretty going well, but I think sometimes tuning into athletes' voice doesn't necessarily mean that they should be physically realistically, we cannot bring all athletes on board when it comes to decision making, right? So sometimes it means that we need more people who are not necessarily athletes, but from the third perspective, who can observe what's actually going on within the all athlete community. So, for example, it's realistically we try to bring most inclusivity as we can, but there are obviously some communities that are left out. There are some countries that are not represented on the board or commission or whatever, right? So it means that we need more people who are not necessarily athletes, but also they could be athletes, but whoever that is, who can observe the inclusivity from the third perspective so that they can advise to the key members of the decision makers to how they can bring best inclusivity on the board, if that makes sense. So I think we need more third opinion, those who are observing the whole landscape from a broader perspective. Sometimes when the people within the Olympic movement can be trapped in their own mind and not be able to see those political situations or human rights issues from the broader perspective. So we need more partnerships. That's why we need more partnerships with the UN agencies, more NGOs, those who are actually in the center of those chaoses, so that we can actually bring everyone on board to navigate through those complex landscapes, if that makes sense. So
So,
we have athletes from Palestine, we have athletes from Israel, we have athletes from, it's Zimbabwe, like everywhere. So obviously for realistic reasons, they cannot, always physically be here, but we need to try our best effort to bring their voice at least somehow through agents, whoever agents that best can be, to bring their voice on board, so that we can hear everyone's voice and really leave no one behind. So those kind of efforts are currently being made, like with the Refugee Foundation. They're doing their great job with bringing in more partnerships, but I think it should be happening within the whole Olympic movement's landscape. And I'm optimistic about it, because we are actually, I am aware they are doing their best job with the new Olympism department and all that. So yeah, we'll see. But I think that's the key method that we should be looking forward to.
finally, since this is called the Sports Governance Podcast, I would like to end with a more conceptual question. Sang-Eun, how would you define the term sports governance today?
Oh, that's a tough question.
I always get the same answer.
I think it aligns with what I've just said. Sport governance is the approach to bring every stakeholder in sport narrative together and bring best amount of inclusivity on the games. The whole point of games, especially at mega events, but all games, the whole point is to bring diversity, diverse athletes from diverse backgrounds, environment, performance level, all that together, and that's what entertains the audience, and that's how the games exist. So I think by bringing more diversity, inclusivity, the sport governance can thrive. And oftentimes when they fail, it's because they fail in doing that. So yeah, bringing more diversity, inclusivity to the games is the key in sport governance, I'd say.
What really comes through in this conversation is that the Olympic movement isn't fixed, but it's evolving. It's easy to talk about the IOC as a distant institution, but hearing Sang-Eun's perspective shows that real efforts are made to put athletes at the center, and that in some cases those efforts are genuinely having impact. With the Winter Olympics about to begin in Milano, Cortina, this episode is also a reminder that athlete-centered governance matters differently depending on who the athletes are. Issues like access, participation, and gender equity, especially in winter sports, don't solve themselves through visibility alone. They require sustained support and structures that allow women athletes not just to compete, but to shape the systems around them. Through programs like IOC Young Leaders and athlete-led initiatives on the ground, we see concrete examples of how athletes, and particularly women athletes, are pushing for change from within the system. At the same time, it is clear that progress in global sport governance takes time. Understanding what's working, why it's working, and how it can be strengthened is key if the Olympic movement wants to stay credible and meaningful long after the Games are over. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help shape the next ones, feel free to share your thoughts or suggest topics you would like to hear more about. And if you found this useful, don't forget to follow the podcast on your streaming platforms and on LinkedIn. You are listening to the Sports Governance Podcast by Yoon Sfideri. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time.